Thank you. Thank you for joining me today. My name is James Solomon. I've been a web developer at Spotify now for a little over 3 years. The whole time I spent on Spotify.com and my transitioning Spotify.com over to Symfony, actually, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Oh, come on, work for me. No. Sorry. There we go. So just in case you don't know, Spotify is a music streaming app where you can play all your music at any time. We have over 20 million paid subscribers, 75 million active users, 30 million songs, or roughly every song except for Taylor Swift. We're available over 58 markets, and currently at around 1,700 employees, over around 800 of which are engineers. And I actually work in the New York office, sorry. So some warm-up to our talk here is the engineering culture at Spotify is somewhat unique. We have this concept of autonomous squads, or what they kind of like to call, every squad is kind of a mini startup. So every squad has everything it needs to do its job on a daily basis, whether that's a designer, a back-end engineer, front-end engineer, agile coach, whatever you need. The idea is that you work independent of every other team, so you're by yourself and you're a mini startup. And then also, we don't have a lot of standards that you have to strictly abide by. So the idea is more of a cross-pollination. So you try something, if you like it, you kind of evangelize that internally. And ideally, more people take that on and it helps out the culture internally, but you don't have to. So you can kind of do whatever you want or whatever suits your squad's needs or for your problems. And we have a very big open source model. We actually use GHE or GitHub Enterprise internally. So much so that every single code that we have in the company is available to you to look at, submit a pull request for you if you're not a part of that team, to the point where there's like a top secret project they're not allowed to talk about, but yet I can go get the code and play with it. We have this motto of think it, build it, ship it, and tweak it, which it helped a lot with our transition to Symfony as well. And there's some cool videos here actually with some really fun artsy drawings of how our culture works. So we're talking about www.spotify.com here, not play.spotify, which is our somewhat okay web player. So Spotify.com is kind of like the marketing site, the account creation, sign up, give us your money, help, features, corporate info, all that kind of general stuff. And that's what we are using now. So some fun facts, I guess, about the site itself. We have around 6,000 requests per second on average. Chrome is the #1 browser. Almost half of our traffic is actually on mobile. I use some Ubuntu Apache web servers, Memcache, MySQL, Debian-based deploys, and a very good version of PHP finally, which is only as of recently. So the first Git commit goes back to December in 2010, but the site existed in various forms prior to that. And someone was working apparently on Christmas too. It looked something like this, so a little ugly, a little old. And with that ugly site, the very first commit introduced much of our legacy framework that we were trying to get away from later on. A lot of fun classes all started in the very first commit, unfortunately. So why would we want to change? Well, a lot of the general issues you might normally think of when it comes to legacy code. Horrible documentation, if there was any. There was no real standards or best practices. We had no real pattern you're following. You're kind of just like a procedural type site or programming site. Lots of static classes, so almost none of the library classes or core classes were actually instantiated objects. They're purely static classes. Because there's no real routing, there's some things hidden in Apache rewrites, so debugging certain pages became fun. And all the core libraries were written from scratch, so your very basic things like loading up a config file, for instance, was recreated from scratch. So there's very little, if no, abstraction. Things were just blatantly right there in the code, calling another function on another class inside of that one which made it fun, if not impossible, to test because you had to, not only if you wanted to isolate one method in a class, you had to go then play with the other class that it's using, and then so on and so forth, maintain the state of all those. And they're all not instantiated, so they're all static, yada yada. And therefore, we had out of 82 classes, we only had 10 that had any tests, and of those 10, there was very few tests within those, which then means we had a lot of manual QA process. We had no integration tests either. So deploying meant, all right, everybody huddle around, click around, and no dependency injection, obviously. So it looks something like this, basically, of one of our more famous, internally famous static classes that called another static function inside of that, and then that one probably called another one, to be honest. So this was very fun to test, and I'm not sure this one even has a unit test. So we had path-based routing, so you just, whatever's on the file system you see in the URI was what you got in the, what was actually on the file system. We used Apache rewrites for more fancy or custom URLs. And this is kind of an important point that comes later on in how we were able to transition, because although this is kind of weird and outdated, it actually made it easy to transition in some ways. Yeah, we all know what that looks like. So limited, if not any templating, except for your basic, you're just using PHP inside, embedded in HTML. So this is one of our static classes, and it was called Page. This is pretty much all of the templating functions it had, and you can probably guess from reading them what they do. Nothing too fancy, and they were called directly within the file themselves. So yeah, you had a lot of, basically your controller and your view was all in one gigantic file. You bootstrapped the file, and then you had your logic, and then you had your code. Because of this, there ended up being lots of copy and pasting. Let's say, I think detecting a user, this was probably copy and pasted on a million different pages. Detect if this user's logged in because this page requires it, redirect out, build the URL, all this stuff. Why someone didn't wrap this beforehand, I'm not sure, but it was like this the way it was. So we're going to walk you through the horrible experience of writing a legacy hello world page real quick, just for fun. You, of course, bootstrapped your file with a little setup file here. And then one thing I want to point out here, because it kind of plays in later, is that we didn't use a dir constant almost in any case, which was interesting. So the relative pathing was relative to where the file was executed. Then we have our basic templating going on here, nothing too fancy. Set your page name, add some JavaScript to the footer, add some CSS to the head, and then this page header function, which is pretty awesome. It looked exactly like this. It literally just includes some file based on the template name you had and starts sending out the rendered HTML to the browser immediately, right? There's your hello world. And then the footer, guess what, looked exactly the same. Oh, sorry. So then the question became, should we use a framework? I actually was starting just as they just were deciding to use a framework. And there was apparently some internal pushback on using a framework at all. Obviously, the people that wrote the original framework did not want to use something like a Symfony or a Zend. So you had to kind of fight against that. But you didn't have to fight, right? You just kind of talked about it, and they could disagree with you. And because we're autonomous, well, we could say we're just still going to do it anyways. So you didn't have to do too much convincing. But you didn't want everyone to hate you for it either, because there are other teams that are going to be using this. It's not just one team. There are other teams using it. Well, my rationale, of course, and other people's is that I don't feel like writing another request class and having bugs in it, and obviously having no unit tests. I'd rather use something like Symfony's where it's been unit tested and tested by a community, which gives you a lot more reliability in the core of the code, which obviously we had very little of in our core code because there was no tests. And we honestly had a lot of business needs as a growing company. We needed to worry about building good pages, upsell people, and things like that. We didn't need to worry about small bugs in a request class or why the JSON file isn't loading the config variables properly. So then maybe you want to know what would you switch to, have that discussion. That's a whole nother discussion. So I wasn't really a part of that discussion either. I was kind of told, hey, we're going to be using Symfony when I started, and do you care? No, it sounds cool to me. I had actually used Zen beforehand and kind of got sick of it. And this was all happening, I think, just as Symfony 2 was coming out. So it was kind of like I felt like a hot topic, if you will, at the moment. CodeIgniter was still supporting PHP 4, I think. And I hadn't personally liked it. I didn't personally like Kohana that much. So it was everyone's just personal opinions, more or less, honestly, going into it. Symfony 2 was chosen, I think, a lot because of its amazing documentation, which helped me a lot when I was even researching it, just to understand how it works, what it's like to use it, using the book to kind of build a bootstrap page from scratch was really helpful. The code itself was honestly easy to read. I thought easier to follow than a lot of others. If there wasn't documentation for something, or you thought it must support this, you would just go read the code itself, and you could easily traverse through and learn more about the code than was even documented, to be honest. And it was great. I thought that, if anything else, should be a reason to use it. The dependency injection stuff was really interesting, especially in comparison to what we were currently using. And the idea that you could override anything based on the service container was really seemed like it would be very helpful in the transition. Obviously, a very large, great active community. The bundling system, although I think it confused a lot of us at first, sounded really intriguing, especially as we knew we could break things out, segment things out into different bundles, and maybe even have different teams. We weren't really sure how you'd use it at the time, but it seemed like an interesting idea, and very flexible and very configurable if you wanted to, at least, which is going to be helpful in our transition. So hooray, we're jumping out and starting with Symfony in October of 2012. It was just kind of inert at the time, first commit, just get it in there. But we needed to start kind of small. We wanted to really go really slow, really small, and not just jump right in as far as switching over to everything of Symfony. So we started very basic. We had a lackluster config system using JSON files that didn't merge very well. It was nowhere near as powerful as the Symfony config YAML system. So we started by just porting that over simply and letting that bootstrap our config stuff and reading from there. Basically, what you'd do is we had a class called, I think, core, and you would put the Symfony container into there, let that get the parameters from there. So now that this old legacy library class is now kind of proxying into Symfony, instead of just trying to replace it, you just replace its usage with Symfony, and so that you don't have to go through and replace everywhere that it was just statically called. And that happened in a lot of use cases for us. You just kind of turned the legacy classes into proxy classes to Symfony. So one of the next things we did, we transitioned our assets over to using aesthetic in Symfony. Before we were using just a make file to execute YUI compressor and things like that, concat files together. We created a couple commands that did things for it, Symfony commands that did things for us that weren't already built in. And at the time, I think we were still all very new to Symfony, so we didn't know about named assets or whatever. So we'd actually just created a twig file, called it watch these files, to just put all of our legacy files in directly, forcing a naming convention instead of what the files used to be generated as. And it allowed us to easily switch over to just having aesthetic do everything for us. From there, the more complex stuff kind of started. So we needed, the idea being that we needed the whole site to both sites to run. Basically, we wanted two sites running, a Symfony version of the site and a legacy version of the site. So we didn't want to create two separate templates and a whole thing where all right, we have this whole nice looking site in legacy mode, but not in Symfony mode. So let's combine that layout system. So what we started to do was deprecate the old things in that crappy page class, created a base level twig layout. Then you had a legacy twig version that extended that base one, and then a regular one for regular Symfony pages. And then we created another thing inside the legacy page class so that when we rendered a legacy page, you would actually pass the body of that legacy page into the render function, which would actually just throw it into the legacy template through Twig. So now we have a lot more powerful layouting system, which was nice as well. And we kind of got to gradually learn this. And we also didn't have a lot of duplication in views because now we're not trying to do things in Symfony and in Legacy. So now the whole layouting system is here in Twig alone. Gives you an idea, this is what we had to do. We kind of like, there's all these variables from those fun static functions before, got all the data out of this page class that happened on rendering of a legacy page, got those as variables that just passed into Twig, and then that returned out the rendered HTML, which was then passed into some other class that is irrelevant, but ultimately that would return you back a Symfony response object. So then the real fun happens, the routing. So before the file or the actual file for the page was the entry point. There was no front controller basically or unified entry point. So we wanted to create that. We forced everything to go through Apache, forced everything to go through like an app.php file we called root.php. And this allowed us to, from there, determine in that file whether or not this is a legacy file or this is going to be a Symfony page. So because of the file system kind of based routing that we had, if you will, all you had to do was check if that file existed on the file system. If it did, that means you rendered out that one as a legacy page, and if it didn't, you assumed you wanted Symfony, which was great. It was that simple. Another thing we ended up doing was modifying and overriding the default HTTP kernel. We wanted to be able to use parts of what a Symfony had as far as the bootstrapping capabilities, like the firewall that happens immediately and the request events, but we didn't want it to go all the way through and execute controller code and everything else that happens after that, at least for a legacy page. We wanted to kind of just do that and then render the legacy page. We had an interesting, I thought it was somewhat interesting use case of doing the firewall, which was we're only available in certain countries. So we use the firewall to actually bounce you to a why are we not available in your country page if you hit a country, if you're in a country that we're not available in. So we use the firewall to kind of push you away from that, the site if you're not available. And that allowed us to that happen in legacy pages as well as Symfony pages. Get an idea, it looks something like this. Because it was a private function, we just copy and pasted it, to be honest, and then just didn't have the rest of what was in the extended version, the parent. So this was the root.php file. So what kind of happens is once you've determined based on the file system if it's a legacy route, we would go through and just do a basic bootstrap of Symfony, which is normally already in the app.php file, like create your request from the globals, whatever else it does, create the app kernel, things like that, get the bootstrap, the autoloader going. But once that's done, you would call the handle legacy to get the firewall and let that return you back a response object, because if that returns you back a response object from one of the request events or from the firewall, you knew you could stop executing at that point, just like normal. And then this comes back to that dir thing that we had, I showed you in the beginning. Because I couldn't just include, now that we're executing every single page from this root PHP file, what happened is all those includes basically errored out because they're now relative to that file's location and not to the location of the file itself. So we actually had to change the directory to the directory of the legacy file, then actually execute the file, capture the output into the output buffer, and then change directories back. And then once we had that HTML rendered from the legacy page, pass that into that page render function I mentioned earlier that went through the Twig templating, gave us back the HTML. Then we went back out and went to this other function that gave us a HTTP response object. And from there, you do your regular Symfony stuff. Symfony routes are easy, right? You just kind of do your regular Symfony thing. Bootstrap Symfony, send it off to the kernel, let it do its thing. And then depending on no matter which path you went, legacy or Symfony, each one gave you back a response object. So then you could just do the response send and then send that off to the terminate, and then you're done. And from here, this is the basics. So now everything else just happens after that. Now you can stop building legacy pages, start building Symfony only pages, and then transition when you have time or whatever. it took a while. We're still doing it, to be honest, 3 years later. But but most of the worst things, like we had a user class that we used. We almost had 2 user classes living in tandem for a while until we had to rewrite that one as a proxy into the Symfony systems user. So now we don't have to teach people the legacy as much. We just say, do everything like Symfony, go read the Symfony docs, build a Symfony page from scratch. And then we got to actually utilize the Symfony bundles, which allowed us to do even less custom things that we didn't need to do or we didn't have to spend time on, which has been really handy. So today we have 11 of our own bundles broken out into more of certain use cases. So like for our credit card processing is all one bundle that has its own views, its own services. Everything for processing our payments on our site is in one bundle. We have started kind of our own custom CMS, and so some of those parts are in their own bundles. We have started our own framework bundle to share Symfony-specific things internally. And let's see, we're still on Symfony 2.3, so we're not using request stack, unfortunately. But now we do have a lot more unit tests, which is awesome. So now it's funner to write unit tests. It makes sense. It's not as painful. We have a lot more of those. Now we have someone actually writing our integrated automated integration tests for us. And because we did a lot of this work as the first team at Spotify, there's actually 2 other big sites that we have, our support site and our open.spotify site, which use Silex actually. Open.spotify might actually get more traffic than Spotify.com because that actually opens up your player when you click a link and whatnot. So it's really basic, which is why we use Silex. But as far as I know, everyone's loved using it, which is great. We've been using Doctrine for some custom CMS stuff. We use a service called SmartLink for our internationalization, but we also have that integrated in with our own custom CMS translation system. So then the future is having more internal sharing of bundles amongst the PHP developers and Symfony users at Spotify. We'd actually looked into using like packages basically internally. Build out this framework bundle more. It's actually not even in its own repo, so no one can really share it right now. We have some custom stuff, some custom things we have made that I think would be cool to open source. They're not in a place right now where they can be, but I think we have some features that I think would be really fun to open source, so hopefully we'll get there. And then ideally, it's to a point where right now, I kind of briefly mentioned it, and it's a whole nother talk, but we deploy with Debian packaging, which is a whole weird system to kind of deploy a website with, and it takes a long time. So it'd be kind of cool to deploy bundles specifically as they change independent, especially since they're kind of independent to a team. Like the payments team in Stockholm might want to deploy change, but now they have to deploy everything, but instead they could just deploy their own bundle maybe by themselves. And now it's a lot prettier. I would say it's probably prettier because of Twig, because it's a lot easier to make it prettier. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for joining me, and I'll take any questions if I think we still have time. Okay.
We've got 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
What's the Spotify player written in? The player that you've got, what is it written in?
Lots of JavaScript.
Is it JavaScript, mainly?
I think it is a PHP app, but it's mostly just to bootstrap all the JavaScript, basically. Just serve it up as a single page, and then the JavaScript itself initializes all the other things. And that's because that's how the actual desktop app is made. So the idea was they deploy once to this like app store, basically internal app store, if you will, and then that goes out to the desktop app and the web app, respectively.
Thanks.
What was the single hardest challenge that you faced when migrating over it? If you haven't already talked about it, and how did you solve it? Was there one specific piece of functionality that you had trouble with?
I don't know. I think it was just troubling to try and do something big like that without knowing Symfony while you're learning Symfony, I guess, because you're also trying to tear it apart and figure out how you can configure it in a more of a custom way, I guess. Biggest challenge, though, well, probably getting just everyone up to speed, because at first it's like one developer who did all this knows Symfony really well, but then everyone else is, well, I've been doing everything legacy still. And so then you're kind of, people didn't stop and learn Symfony, so you had to kind of catch them as they're learning and saying, hey, you're still doing this kind of an old way. There's actually this thing you can do. So there's still, like, if you will, not bugs, but like almost legacy of the learning curve that happened along the way. Thank you.
Thanks, James.